The first reports did not arrive as urgent alarms. They came in fragments, scattered across routine dispatches and logistical notes that were easy to overlook amid the constant movement of advancing lines. Mentions of reduced rations, of delays in supply distribution, of prisoners appearing weaker than expected. Nothing in isolation suggested a crisis. But when these fragments began to align, forming a pattern that repeated across multiple units moving through the same sector, the tone shifted. Something inside one of the prisoner of war camps ahead was not functioning as it should. And by the time those reports reached George S. Patton, they carried a weight that extended beyond simple supply failure. The Allied advance had been moving steadily, pressing through territories that only weeks earlier had been firmly under German control. Roads were crowded with a mixture of military convoys, displaced civilians, and the lingering infrastructure of a retreating force that no longer had the capacity to maintain order. Fuel dumps left behind, abandoned vehicles, scattered equipment, all signs of a system under strain. Yet within this broader collapse, certain structures remained intact, particularly those tied to the containment of prisoners. Camps, by their nature, depended on control and routine, and even in retreat, they were often maintained with rigid discipline. It was this contradiction that first drew attention. As reconnaissance units approached the area in question, they noted that the camp perimeter was still guarded, its boundaries clearly marked, its internal layout largely undisturbed. From a distance, it did not resemble a place in chaos. There were no signs of open revolt, no visible breakdown in security. But the closer the units moved, the more the details began to shift. Movement within the camp was slower than expected. Figures gathered near the fencing lacked the alertness typically seen in prisoners anticipating liberation. Instead, there was a stillness, a kind of subdued exhaustion that did not match the surrounding momentum of the advancing front. The first visual confirmations came not from official inspection, but from soldiers observing quietly as they passed along the perimeter. They noticed how the prisoners stood, how their uniforms hung loosely from their frames, how even simple movements, turning the head, raising an arm, seemed to require effort. These were not men who had simply endured captivity. These were men who had been worn down over time, their physical condition reflecting something more prolonged than temporary shortage. And yet, just beyond the inner compounds, the structures assigned to German personnel told a different story. Supply areas appeared organized. Storage points showed no immediate signs of depletion. Equipment was maintained, not abandoned. There were indicators of strain, certainly, but not of the kind that would explain the condition of the prisoners. The imbalance was not hidden. It was visible to anyone willing to compare one side of the camp to the other. And it was in that comparison that the situation began to take on a different meaning. When word reached Patton's command structure with these added observations, the issue shifted from uncertainty to concern. The question was no longer whether there was a shortage, but how that shortage was being managed, and for whom. In a military environment defined by hierarchy and allocation, scarcity did not affect all groups equally. Decisions were made, priorities established, and those priorities often revealed more about the system than the resources themselves. As his forces moved closer, the atmosphere around the camp became increasingly defined by contrast. Outside the perimeter, the pace of the Allied advance continued, marked by urgency and coordination. Vehicles moved in sequence, orders were relayed efficiently, and units maintained their operational rhythm. Inside the perimeter, time seemed to slow. The prisoners remained in place, their presence almost static against the shifting backdrop of the war moving past them. Weather conditions added another layer to the scene. The air carried a lingering chill, the kind that settled into clothing and made prolonged exposure difficult. For well-supplied soldiers, it was an inconvenience. For those already weakened, it became another factor contributing to their decline. The ground within the camp showed signs of overuse. Worn paths cutting through areas where movement had become routine but minimal. There was little indication of recent activity beyond necessity. No signs of organized exercise. No evidence of structured routine beyond the bare minimum required to maintain order. As the situation came into clearer focus, it also began to raise questions that extended beyond immediate conditions. Camps were not isolated entities. They operated within a broader network of command and supply. If resources were limited, that limitation would typically be reflected across all levels. But here, the disparity suggested selective distribution. It implied that decisions had been made not simply out of necessity, but out of judgment. judgment about who was entitled to what, even under constrained circumstances. The presence of German officers within the camp reinforced this impression. Their conduct, their appearance, and the state of their quarters indicated that while conditions may not have been comfortable, they were far from the level of deprivation seen among the prisoners. This was not a uniform experience of hardship. It was a divided one, shaped by roles and reinforced by authority. By the time Patton's units prepared to enter and formally assess the camp, the situation had already taken on a distinct character. It was no longer viewed as a logistical anomaly or a byproduct of a collapsing front. It was understood as something more deliberate, or at the very least, something that had been allowed to continue without correction. The imbalance between available resources and their distribution pointed toward a breakdown not in supply, but in responsibility. And within that realization lay the foundation for what would follow. Because in a system defined by command, where authority determined action and inaction alike, the condition of the prisoners was not just a reflection of circumstance, it was a reflection of choice. The entry into the camp did not unfold with urgency or confusion, but with a deliberate, measured pace that reflected the expectations of a controlled environment. The gates, though worn, were still functional, opened without resistance by guards who showed neither panic nor defiance. There was no sign of last-minute scrambling, no attempt to conceal conditions or rearrange appearances. Instead, what revealed itself did so gradually, as though the reality inside had settled into a state so normalized that it no longer required justification. And within moments of stepping past the perimeter, the condition of the prisoners became impossible to misinterpret. They did not move toward the arriving soldiers with the energy often seen in newly liberated men. There was no surge forward, no raised voices or sudden gestures of relief. Instead, many remained where they were, watching with a stillness that suggested both awareness and restraint. Those who did approach did so slowly, their movements measured and cautious, as though conserving what little strength remained. Their uniforms hung loosely, fabric no longer shaped by the bodies beneath, but draped over frames that had thinned beyond recognition. Faces were drawn, not only from hunger, but from the accumulation of fatigue that no single meal could reverse. The physical signs were consistent across the camp. Arms showed sharp outlines of bone beneath skin, hands trembled even when at rest, and the simple act of standing appeared to require concentration. Some leaned subtly against nearby structures, using walls or posts for support without drawing attention to it. Others sat on the ground, not in groups or formation, but wherever they had last paused, as if movement itself had become optional. There was no visible system organizing their time or activity. The routines that once defined captivity had eroded, leaving behind only the minimum needed to maintain order. Medical conditions, though not immediately catalogued, revealed themselves through observation. Skin carried a dull tone, lacking the vitality expected even under hardship. Small injuries appeared untreated or poorly managed, suggesting limited access to care or insufficient resources allocated toward recovery. The air carried a faint but persistent scent of unwashed clothing and damp earth, a combination that spoke to prolonged neglect rather than temporary disruption. Nothing about the environment indicated a sudden breakdown. It reflected a slow, sustained decline. Beyond the prisoner compounds, the layout of the camp remained structured. Pathways between buildings were clear, guard positions were maintained, and storage areas were intact. There was no evidence of abandonment or disorder among the facilities assigned to German personnel. Equipment was arranged with purpose, not scattered or discarded. The contrast did not require explanation. It presented itself in the separation between spaces, each governed by different standards. The officer in charge was located without difficulty. His position within the camp was defined not by distance from the prisoners, but by the condition of his surroundings. His quarters, though not luxurious, were maintained with a level of care absent elsewhere. Clothing was orderly, personal equipment accounted for, and his posture reflected an awareness of authority that had not diminished with the shifting front. When approached, he did not attempt to evade responsibility, nor did he display overt defensiveness. Instead, he engaged with a composure that suggested he viewed the situation as within the bounds of acceptable conduct. His explanation followed a pattern that aligned with established military reasoning. Resources, he stated, were limited. Supply lines had been disrupted by the advancing forces, and prioritization had become necessary. Under such conditions, decisions had to be made regarding allocation, and those decisions, in his view, had been consistent with maintaining operational stability. Personnel required to oversee the camp needed to remain functional, and that function depended on access to sufficient provisions. Prisoners, while still under guard, did not occupy the same level of priority. The argument was presented without visible hesitation. It was not framed as a justification, but as a matter of procedure. War, he implied, imposed conditions that could not accommodate equal distribution. The expectation of parity, particularly under strain, was unrealistic. What had occurred within the camp was, in his assessment, not a failure, but an adaptation to circumstance. The condition of the prisoners, though severe, was described as an unfortunate but unavoidable outcome of broader limitations. Yet the environment surrounding this explanation introduced inconsistencies that could not be easily dismissed. Storage areas, though not abundant, contained supplies that had been organized and preserved. The absence of widespread deterioration among German personnel suggested that scarcity had not been uniformly applied. The gap between what was claimed and what was visible created a tension that extended beyond disagreement. It raised the question of whether limitation had been interpreted selectively, shaped not only by necessity, but by perception of obligation. Interactions between guards and prisoners further reinforced this divide. Guards moved with routine confidence, their duties carried out without urgency or apparent strain. Their condition, while not untouched by the realities of war, did not mirror the decline seen among those they oversaw. Communication between the two groups was minimal, limited to directives rather than exchanges. There was no indication of escalating conflict, no visible breakdown in discipline. Instead, there existed a quiet separation, maintained through structure rather than force. Within this structure, responsibility became diffuse. The officer maintained that decisions were made within constraints imposed from above, that supply shortages were not of his making, and that adherence to hierarchy dictated his actions. By directing attention toward external factors, the locus of accountability shifted outward, away from the immediate environment and into the broader context of a war that had already begun to fragment established systems. However, the physical state of the prisoners resisted abstraction. It anchored the situation in tangible reality, where outcomes could be observed directly, rather than interpreted through policy. The contrast between explanation and evidence did not resolve into clarity. Instead, it deepened the complexity of the moment, positioning the camp not as an isolated failure, but as a point where decisions, constraints, and values intersected under pressure. As the assessment continued, it became evident that the issue at hand was not confined to supply levels alone. It encompassed the manner in which authority was exercised, the criteria used to determine necessity, and the extent to which responsibility was accepted or deferred. The camp functioned, its systems intact, its hierarchy maintained. Yet within that functionality existed a condition that reflected more than circumstance. It reflected the outcomes of choices made within the boundaries of that system, choices that would now be examined not only for their practicality, but for their alignment with the standards imposed by those who had arrived to take control. Closer inspection did not require extraordinary effort. It required time, patience, and a willingness to look past formal explanations into the quiet details that defined daily function within the camp. What had initially appeared as a strained but intact system began to separate into layers, each revealing a different standard applied to those within it. The claim of limited resources remained present in every formal exchange, repeated with consistency and supported by references to disrupted supply lines and the broader collapse unfolding across German-held territory. Yet the physical environment did not fully align with that narrative, and it was within these subtle misalignments that the deeper reality began to take shape. Storage areas, though not abundant, were neither empty nor neglected. Crates were stacked in an orderly manner, their markings still legible, their contents partially intact. Ration tins, preserved goods, and basic provisions could be accounted for, not in quantities that suggested comfort, but in amounts sufficient to demonstrate that distribution decisions had been made with selectivity. There was no indication that supplies had been exhausted entirely. Instead, they appeared managed, controlled, and directed along lines that were not openly acknowledged but clearly enforced. The proximity of these resources to the prisoner compounds made their absence from prisoner use more conspicuous. German personnel, observed over extended periods rather than in passing moments, showed a different pattern of condition. Their movements retained coordination and steadiness. Conversations among them carried normal cadence, not the slowed or fragmented speech often associated with prolonged hunger. Uniforms, while worn, maintained structure and the physical signs of severe deprivation, sunken features, weakened posture, involuntary tremors, were largely absent. This contrast did not suggest abundance, but it did suggest stability, a baseline that had been preserved through prioritization. The act of prioritization itself was not unusual in a military context. Under conditions of scarcity, allocation decisions were expected, often necessary for maintaining operational capability. What distinguished this situation was not the existence of prioritization, but the criteria upon which it appeared to be based. The line dividing those who received adequate sustenance from those who did not was not drawn purely along functional necessity. Prisoners, though removed from active duty, remained under the responsibility of the command structure that controlled the camp. Their condition, therefore, could not be fully separated from the decisions made by those in authority. As officers and accompanying personnel continued their assessment, patterns of interaction reinforced this emerging understanding. Requests from prisoners for additional food were met not with negotiation or explanation, but with dismissal or redirection. Guards responded in a manner that suggested adherence to standing orders rather than situational judgment. There was no visible effort to reassess or adapt in response to deteriorating conditions. Instead, there was consistency, a repetition of behavior that indicated the system was operating as intended, not failing unintentionally. When these observations were brought into direct discussion with the officer in charge, the responses maintained their earlier structure, but began to show subtle shifts in emphasis. The language of limitation remained, but it was increasingly paired with references to discipline, to the necessity of maintaining order, and to the risks associated with altering established routines. Feeding prisoners beyond a certain level, it was implied, could introduce instability, could encourage expectation, could weaken the authority required to manage the camp effectively. In this framing, restriction was not only a response to scarcity, but a tool of control. This perspective introduced a dimension that extended beyond logistical reasoning. It suggested that the condition of the prisoners was not solely the byproduct of constrained resources, but also the result of deliberate policy, shaped by perception. Prisoners were not viewed as temporary wards requiring maintenance until transfer or liberation. They were positioned lower within the hierarchy of concern, their needs subordinated to the preservation of structure and authority within the camp. The deprivation they experienced, therefore, became both a consequence and a reinforcement of that position. The tension within the camp environment began to shift accordingly. What had initially presented as a potential misunderstanding of supply capacity now appeared as a divergence in interpretation of duty. For the German command, duty had been defined narrowly, focused on maintaining control, preserving order, and sustaining those directly responsible for that control. For the arriving Allied forces, duty encompassed a broader expectation, one that included the treatment of prisoners as an extension of military conduct rather than an exception to it. This divergence did not manifest in immediate confrontation. Instead, it settled into the atmosphere of the camp, influencing the manner in which each observation was made and each decision considered. Conversations became more precise, less accepting of generalized explanations. Measurements were taken, inventories reviewed, and the flow of supplies traced with increasing attention to detail. Each step reinforced the same conclusion. The disparity between available resources and their distribution could not be fully explained by external constraints alone. Environmental cues further supported this assessment. Cooking areas assigned to German personnel showed signs of regular use, with utensils cleaned and stored. Surfaces maintained despite the overall strain of wartime conditions. In contrast, facilities available to prisoners appeared underutilized, not from lack of need, but from lack of provision. The absence of activity in these spaces spoke as clearly as the presence of order elsewhere. It indicated not neglect through oversight, but neglect through omission. Within this framework, accountability began to take on a more defined shape. The diffusion of responsibility that had initially shielded individual decision-making grew less effective as the chain of command was examined more closely. Orders, whether explicit or implied, had been enacted consistently. The officer in charge, while referencing pressures from above, had exercised discretion in implementation. That discretion, as revealed through the condition of the camp, had been applied in a manner that favored preservation of authority over equitable distribution. The situation, therefore, moved beyond the realm of logistical failure. It entered a space where decisions were evaluated not only for their practicality, but for their alignment with the principles expected under military command. The question was no longer whether resources were limited, but how those limitations had been interpreted and enforced. In that distinction lay the core of the unfolding tension, one that would determine how authority within the camp would be addressed, redefined, and ultimately resolved under the presence of those now positioned to assume control. The shift from observation to confrontation did not happen abruptly, but once it began, it carried a clarity that removed any remaining ambiguity. The accumulation of evidence, the consistency of disparity, and the officer's own explanations had narrowed the situation to a single point of focus: decision-making. What had been described as limitation could no longer stand without challenge, and what had been presented as procedure now required justification under direct scrutiny. When George S. Patton entered the exchange, the tone of the camp changed in a way that was subtle but unmistakable, as though the existing structure had been forced to recognize an authority it could not absorb into its own hierarchy. The German officer maintained his composure, but the nature of his responses began to shift. Where earlier he had relied on references to supply disruption and operational necessity, he now spoke with greater emphasis on principle. The treatment of prisoners, he suggested, was not merely a matter of resources but of classification. They were, in his view, outside the primary obligations of command, their status defined not by shared military structure, but by opposition. Responsibility, as he framed it, was not universal. It was conditional, determined by allegiance and reinforced by the expectations placed upon him within his own system. This articulation did not emerge as an apology or even as a defense in the conventional sense. It was presented with the steadiness of a position long held, one that had not required reconsideration until confronted by an external authority operating under different assumptions. In that moment, the divide between the two perspectives became fully visible. The condition of the prisoners, the distribution of resources, and the maintenance of order were no longer isolated issues. They became expressions of a deeper framework through which duty itself was defined. Patton's response did not rely on raised voice or visible agitation. It carried weight through its directness, through the absence of hesitation, in challenging the premise that obligation could be selectively applied. Within his command philosophy, discipline extended beyond the immediate function of a unit. It encompassed the conduct of those under authority, including the treatment of individuals who no longer posed a threat. The expectation was not based on convenience or advantage, but on the maintenance of standards that defined the structure itself. To allow deviation in one area, particularly one so visible, was to introduce instability into the broader system. The exchange unfolded without spectacle, yet its implications reached beyond the confines of the camp. Each statement, each measured reply, reinforced the presence of two doctrines operating in parallel but incompatible ways. On one side was a system that had adapted to prolonged conflict by narrowing its scope of responsibility, prioritizing control and efficiency even at the cost of those deemed outside its core. On the other was a system that, despite the same pressures, maintained an expectation of consistent conduct across all levels, viewing discipline not as a tool applied selectively, but as a principle sustained regardless of circumstance. Around them the environment remained unchanged, yet its meaning deepened. The prisoners, still positioned within their compounds, became the silent evidence of the choices under discussion. Their condition no longer required interpretation. It stood as the outcome of a doctrine put into practice. The guards, maintaining their routines, reflected the continuity of that doctrine. Their actions aligned with orders that had not been questioned until now. The camp itself, with its intact structure and visible disparities, served as a physical representation of how authority had been exercised. As the confrontation continued, the German officer's position grew more defined, not less. He did not retreat into uncertainty or concede under pressure. Instead, he reiterated his adherence to the framework within which he operated, emphasizing that deviation from that framework would have constituted a failure of his duty as he understood it. In this there was a consistency that, while not aligned with the expectations of his counterpart, revealed the depth to which the system had been internalized. His decisions were not portrayed as exceptions. They were presented as the logical outcome of a set of beliefs reinforced over time. Patton's presence, however, introduced a boundary that could not be negotiated within that framework. Authority, in this context, was no longer abstract. It was immediate, backed by the advancing force that had already begun to reshape the conditions of the war. The question was not whether the German officer's interpretation held internal consistency, but whether it could stand when measured against the standards now imposed upon the camp. The answer did not require declaration. It was evident in the shift of control that was beginning to take place. The tension did not resolve into a single decisive moment. Instead, it settled into a transition, where the existing structure was gradually overtaken by a new set of expectations. Orders began to change, not in tone, but in substance. The distribution of resources, once governed by selective criteria, was redirected. The boundaries that had defined obligation were expanded, not through negotiation, but through enforcement of a different standard. The officer, while still present, no longer operated as the final authority. His role had been reduced, not through removal, but through the redefinition of command around him. In the space that followed, the clash between doctrines remained visible, not as an active confrontation, but as a contrast embedded within the actions that replaced it. The prisoners, still bearing the effects of prolonged deprivation, became the immediate focus of those actions. The guards, adjusting to new directives, reflected the adaptability of individuals within shifting systems. And the camp itself, once a contained expression of a particular interpretation of duty, began to transform under the influence of a different one. What remained constant was the recognition that the situation had never been solely about resources. It had been shaped by decisions grounded in belief, by the extent to which responsibility was accepted or limited. In confronting those decisions, Patton had not introduced a new complexity, but had brought into focus the one that had always been present. And in doing so, he altered not only the conditions within the camp, but the framework through which those conditions would be understood from that point forward. The change did not arrive with a burst of force or a visible rupture in the camp's routine. Instead, it unfolded through a sequence of controlled decisions that carried the weight of authority without the need for spectacle. Once the confrontation had clarified the nature of the problem, the next step became less about argument and more about structure. Orders were issued with a precision that left little room for interpretation, and those orders did not seek to punish immediately, but to re-establish a chain of responsibility that had been allowed to narrow beyond its intended scope. In that sense, the shift was not disruptive in appearance, but fundamental in effect. At the center of this transition stood George S. Patton, whose approach reflected a preference for clarity over escalation. The German officer was not removed in a dramatic gesture, nor was he subjected to public reprimand. Instead, his authority was quietly but decisively reduced. Decisions that had previously flowed through him were redirected, his role reframed from command to compliance within a structure now governed by external oversight. The change was immediate in its application, yet restrained in its presentation, reinforcing the idea that authority could be redefined without dismantling the entire system around it. The first visible adjustments occurred within the camp's supply framework. Storage areas that had been managed under selective distribution were open to reassessment, their contents catalogued and reassigned according to new directives. Food, previously allocated along hierarchical lines, began to move toward the prisoner compounds with a consistency that had been absent before. The process was not chaotic. It followed an organized pattern, overseen by personnel who approached the task as a matter of duty rather than correction. Each distribution point became a site where the new standard was applied, replacing omission with inclusion in a manner that emphasized function over reaction. The prisoners themselves responded in ways that reflected both immediate need and lingering uncertainty. At first, the change in distribution did not produce visible shifts in behavior. Years of conditioning within the camp environment had established expectations that were not easily altered. Food, when it arrived in increased quantity, was received with caution as much as relief. Movements remained measured, conversations subdued. It was only over time, as the pattern of distribution stabilized, that a gradual adjustment became apparent. Strength, once depleted, began to return in small increments, visible in posture, in pace, in the ability to engage with surroundings beyond immediate necessity. Among the German personnel, the adjustment required a different kind of recalibration. Guards who had operated under one set of directives were now required to follow another, not through persuasion, but through the redefinition of command above them. Their routines shifted accordingly, maintaining order while adapting to the new expectations placed upon them. There was no widespread resistance, but there was a noticeable transition period in which established habits gave way to revised procedures. Authority, once centralized within the camp's original structure, now flowed through a broader framework that incorporated Allied oversight as the determining force. The environment of the camp began to reflect these changes in subtle but consistent ways. Areas that had been underutilized due to lack of provision saw renewed activity. Cooking spaces assigned to prisoner use, previously dormant, were brought into operation, their function restored as part of a larger effort to normalize conditions. Pathways within the compounds, once marked by slow and infrequent movement, showed increased circulation as physical capacity improved. These were not dramatic transformations, but they indicated a shift from stagnation toward recovery, guided by the steady application of resources. Throughout this process, the emphasis remained on restoring order rather than asserting dominance. There were no public displays of punishment, no attempts to dramatize the change in control. The focus stayed on the practical elements of command, allocation, supervision, and accountability. By addressing these elements directly, the response avoided the pitfalls of reactionary measures that might have disrupted the stability of the camp further. Instead, it reinforced a model in which authority was exercised through consistency and clarity, aligning the camp's operations with the broader expectations of Allied conduct. The German officer, now operating within this revised structure, became a figure defined more by limitation than by command. His presence remained, but his capacity to influence outcomes had been curtailed. Interactions with him were conducted within the parameters of the new hierarchy, his previous justifications no longer serving as a basis for decision-making. In this, the transition underscored a principle that extended beyond the immediate situation. Authority, when misaligned with established standards, could be adjusted without dismantling the system entirely, provided that the framework supporting it was reasserted with precision. As days passed, the cumulative effect of these changes became more pronounced. The initial disparity that had defined the camp began to narrow, not through equalization of hardship, but through redistribution that addressed the most critical deficiencies. Prisoners, while still bearing the effects of prolonged neglect, were no longer subject to the same level of deprivation. German personnel, while adapting to new directives, continued to perform their roles within the adjusted system. The camp, once a reflection of selective responsibility, began to function as a unified environment under a redefined command structure. What distinguished this phase was its restraint. The absence of overt retaliation did not indicate leniency, but rather a deliberate choice to prioritize restoration over retribution. In the context of an advancing war, where resources and attention were constantly divided, such an approach ensured that the camp could be stabilized without diverting energy toward measures that would not contribute to its immediate function. The reassertion of command, therefore, operated as both a corrective and a preventive action, addressing the present condition while establishing a standard for future conduct. In this measured transition, the broader implications of the confrontation became evident. The issue had never been solely about the presence or absence of food. It had been about how authority interpreted its responsibilities under constraint, and how those interpretations shaped outcomes for those within its control. By redefining that authority, by extending its scope to include those previously excluded, the response did more than alter conditions within a single camp. It reaffirmed a principle that would guide subsequent actions, ensuring that discipline remained not only a tool of command, but a standard applied across all levels of engagement. In the days that followed, the camp did not remain an isolated point of observation. It became one among many similar sites encountered, as Allied forces pushed deeper into territory where administrative order was no longer consistent, but fragmented into pockets of remaining control and emerging collapse. What had taken place there was recorded, not as an extraordinary anomaly, but as part of a recurring pattern that began to appear across multiple locations. Each instance carried its own local conditions, yet the underlying structure of the problem remained recognizable: authority under strain, resources unevenly distributed, and responsibility shaped as much by interpretation as by formal instruction. As the final phases of the war unfolded, the coherence of command systems on the German side showed increasing signs of erosion. Frontline breakdowns had already forced rapid withdrawals, but behind those movements, the administrative and logistical frameworks that once supported them were also weakening. Camps, depots, and holding areas that depended on centralized coordination began to operate with greater independence, not by design, but by necessity. Orders became less consistent, oversight less immediate, and the space between directive and execution widened. It was within that space that individual decisions gained greater influence over outcomes that had previously been governed by uniform policy. The treatment of prisoners in particular reflected this shift with striking clarity. Under stable conditions, even within the constraints of war, procedures governing prisoners of war were typically defined by established codes and enforced through structured hierarchies. But as those hierarchies fractured, the enforcement of such codes became uneven. In some locations, standards were maintained through institutional discipline. In others, they were interpreted loosely, filtered through the priorities of local command, or subordinated to competing demands for survival and control. The result was not a single pattern of behavior, but a spectrum shaped by circumstance. What emerged from these variations was a broader understanding of how authority behaves when its structural support begins to fail. Decisions that might once have been constrained by oversight now reflected the immediate judgment of those in position at the ground level. Scarcity intensified this effect, not simply by limiting resources, but by forcing prioritization in environments where moral and operational guidelines were no longer uniformly enforced. In such conditions, ideology often filled the gaps left by institutional uncertainty, providing justification for actions that might otherwise have been subject to stricter scrutiny. Within this broader context, the events at the camp took on a different significance. They were no longer viewed solely through the lens of a single confrontation or a localized correction of conditions. Instead, they became illustrative of a wider dynamic playing out across multiple fronts. The imbalance observed there, between those receiving adequate provision and those deprived of it, was not unique in its existence, but distinct in how clearly it revealed the mechanisms behind it. The presence of intact supplies alongside severe deprivation, the persistence of hierarchy despite collapsing logistics, and the reliance on selective obligation, all reflected tensions that were being replicated elsewhere in varying degrees. For Allied command structures, these observations contributed to a growing recognition that the end stages of the conflict were not defined solely by military engagement, but by administrative disintegration. As control fragmented, responsibility shifted downward, and with that shift came variability in how rules were applied and interpreted. In some cases, this allowed for corrective intervention when higher oversight was absent. In others, it resulted in outcomes that diverged significantly from established norms, depending on the values and decisions of individuals placed in positions of temporary authority. The broader implication of these patterns was not confined to any single doctrine or command philosophy. Rather, it highlighted the intersection of three persistent forces within wartime systems: authority, scarcity, and ideology. Authority determined structure and enforcement, scarcity dictated constraint and prioritization, and ideology shaped interpretation when the first two were no longer sufficient to provide clear guidance. When these forces aligned under stable conditions, they produced predictable outcomes. When they diverged, particularly under collapse, they generated variability that could be observed across even closely related environments. In retrospect, incidents like the one at the camp served as reference points within this larger landscape. They provided concrete examples of how abstract pressures manifested at ground level, where decisions had immediate consequences for those under control. They also demonstrated how quickly the meaning of responsibility could shift when the frameworks supporting it were no longer uniformly applied. What remained consistent across these observations was not the outcome itself, but the mechanism, the way in which authority adapted, fractured, or reasserted itself in response to changing conditions. As the war moved toward its conclusion, such patterns became increasingly valuable for understanding not only what had occurred, but how it had occurred. The closing chapters of the conflict were shaped less by isolated decisions than by the accumulation of localized actions operating within weakening structures. Each site, each command post, each camp contributed a fragment to a broader picture of systems under strain, and within that picture, the events observed in this particular case stood as a clear expression of how rapidly the balance between control and interpretation could shift when the foundations of authority began to give way.